Welcome back to this post-election edition of Midwest Talking Points. We know quite a bit about the results of the elections. We know that voter turnout was at an all-time high nationwide. But let's take a closer look at how things went right here in Missouri as we welcome newly re-elected Missouri Secretary of State Robin Carnahan. Welcome, Secretary Carnahan.
Welcome. Great to be here. How y'all doing?
Doing great, thank you. Before we talk about the elections, one thing that I wanted to ask you to explain to our viewers more about your job. The Secretary of State's office every 2 years at various times has a lot of huge role around the elections, but you do a lot of other things. Can you tell us a little bit about the office?
Yeah, it's interesting. The elections part is a small part of what we do in the Secretary of State's office, mainly because elections are all locally run. So we help supervise and oversee those for the local election authorities, but what we mainly do is serve other Missourians who need something out of state government. Might be a business person who wants to start a business, and we help them get that done, and cut red tape and save them money, and a lot of that's done online now. Investors, we protect investors. That's one of our jobs. It's very important, particularly in these uncertain economic times. And then, of course, we have the state archives, which is fantastic, and people love it, and we've had tens of millions of hits on our archives website. So it's really about getting things done for Missourians, so I feel really good about that.
But let's get to the election results now, and overseeing the statewide elections process is a huge task. It seemed to go pretty smoothly. Tell us what you thought of what happened.
You know, it really did go remarkably smoothly, and I think that's a credit to the local election officials and all the preparation that they did. But, we've been talking with them for a couple of years about what could be a very major high turnout election, and a couple of the things we focused on were, number one, the sort of mechanics of making sure that there were enough paper ballots, that no one had to go through what happened in 2006, which was stand in an hours-long line because they ran out of ballots and didn't print enough. So we spent a lot of time on that, and I'm happy to report nobody ran out of paper ballots this year, and so no one had to deal with that issue. And the second was that the people part of elections, and that is the poll workers and the folks who actually make it work. So we invested a lot in recruiting new poll workers, training them, getting materials together, and I think that paid off too.
Do you think that the Help America Vote Act, our viewers may know it, this after 2000 there was this rush to fix the problems, and like only the federal government could do, they threw a lot of money at it and then sort of sometimes got in the way. All told now, you've seen it for 2 cycles. How's the Help America Vote Act really worked out, and what could be done better? How does it need to be fixed?
I think there are a couple of things about it that made a lot of sense. One of the things that we had in Missouri as a result of that was our first statewide voter registration list. As you know, prior to that, every county had its own voter list, which meant there could be a lot of duplicates and a lot of just sort of inconsistency in these lists. We now have consolidated that and have the cleanest, best voter list in the state's history, and I think that gives people confidence about the elections. And it avoids some of the problems we saw in 2000 about people, showing up to vote and their name not being on a list. So that's a lot better than it was. And then, of course, they phased out punch card ballots, which we've never had really big problems in Missouri with, but we have all these new voting systems now, and I think voters are now comfortable with it. And we've also done a few other things that were outside of HAVA, like increasing audit standards and other things to make sure people are confident about the results.
I think that one area that you and Republican Secretary of States and Democrats have come together is thinking about early voting across the country. And my experience that we've talked about in the city, you worry about all kinds of different aspects of, like you said, the people working at the polls, and early voting has shown you could maybe kind of diminish that and manage it. But can you tell us how early voting, people when they think early voting, they think sort of, I don't know, they don't know what to make of it. They don't know whether it's absentee ballots with a twist or internet voting. What's the reality of all that?
There are lots of permutations of how this works in other states, but the bottom line is over 30 other states have some form of early voting, which means you can vote prior to Election Day with no excuse. In Missouri, you still have to have an excuse. And it's confusing for people. This year, I know we saw an increase in absentee ballots. If you talk to most election authorities, they think that's just because if you're watching television and you see people early voting, people in Missouri think, well, I need to do that too. And they don't realize until they show up that they have to sign an affidavit that says they're going to be sick or out of town and can't make it to the polls that day. So I think it's ridiculous to make people go through this anymore. And there are states across the board that have done it. 7 of our 8 neighboring states have this. It works, it's secure, it's convenient for voters, and it's good for the election process because it reduces the pressure on the election officials on election day.
And really makes it go smoother on election day because more people have already voted.
And we saw that in a lot of other states.
Do they vote at the headquarters, or in most places do they have like centers around the community?
There are different states have different ways of doing this. Some do it by mail, others do it at the local election authority office, others have vote centers. And so we have a proposal that's actually the same as what Matt Blunt proposed when he was Secretary of State.
Must be good. Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
Well, I think it is pretty good.
But it hasn't gotten passed yet.
Right, and we ought to recognize that if both Matt Blunt thinks it's good and I think it's good, maybe it's good, and we ought to just get the legislators to pass it. And it lets the current process of absentee voting continue. So if you're really going to be out of town or unable to get to the polls, you can do that. But it also adds on top of that a 2-week period prior to Election Day where you can just walk in and vote whenever you want, when it's convenient for you. And it makes sense.
So it gives another option to voters,
Absolutely.
Basically. It doesn't change a whole lot, but just adds this other option.
Right.
Well, hopefully we'll see that happen in Missouri over the next few months if everybody works together.
I hope so, and because this, people wonder if there's some partisan advantage to be had. I think that's not the case. I think there's no way to determine that. And if you look at all the other states that have early voting, some vote for Republicans, some vote for Democrats, but in the end, everybody says it's great for voters.
And I wondered because the Obama campaign was so smart about both absentee balloting and early voting, but what I mean is that in the city and county, most people voted early in the day. It was very interesting. It was it was quieter in the afternoon. Can you talk a little bit about, you've observed Missouri elections for a lot of years, both yourself on the ballot, your family. It was a very interesting election. I mean, we had the state go by a very minor margin to McCain. We had Attorney General Jay Nixon win by 18 points. You win with the largest number of votes ever for anyone, and yet we had Senate races go to Republicans. And what's going on in Missouri?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think you can't sort of pinpoint it right now. We're going to have to do more in-depth analysis, and I'm not a political scientist either, but clearly voters picked and chose all through the ballot about who they felt comfortable with, and there were no sort of particular partisan alliances that sort of kept them voting one party or another.
So, and besides this, what I call a mosaic of the map here, do you see the opportunity for more voters to get involved going forward? I mean, this is record turnout. Does this mean that once voters vote once, they're going to vote again and again?
Well, that's traditionally what people in the elections world think, that if you get somebody voting at a young age, chances are they're going to come back and be voters for life. And if they miss those first couple of elections, it's hard to get them tied into the process again. So I'm really enthusiastic. We had 340,000 new voters registered just in 2008, and about 150,000 of those, more than 45%, were 18 to 24-year-olds. So I think that bodes really well for our democracy going forward.
Do you know yet if those 240,000 in 08, do we know how many of those? 340,000 in 08. Do we know how many of those actually voted?
Don't know yet, but we'll be able to figure that out because we now have a statewide voter list.
Yeah, because it always makes you wonder. They get a huge voter registration. Sometimes you wonder if, especially students and young people, if they actually get there. But it is amazing. I got to ask you the question that we've sort of discussed at length in the past: vote fraud, voter fraud, and questions of people voting on both sides of the river and all that kind of. I know you've been fighting against that in your time, and you have. What was this year's election in Missouri? What are you seeing so far?
Well, Ed, we've talked about this, and everybody's against voter fraud. The question is that it's a two-sided coin. One is guaranteeing access to people and preventing fraud, and you have to pay attention to both of those things if you're going to have a fair election. And I'm happy to report that we haven't heard any instances of these problems that have been talked about. Obviously, the issue with some voter registrations came up before the election, and I'm really proud of the election officials because they caught that before anybody was added to the voter list. So I say job well done to them, and we'll take a look and see if there's anything else that's come up, but nothing that's been reported to us, which I'm really proud of.
What about deceptive practices? I'd seen something about text messages.
Right. That was really problematic. The day before the election, we had lots of reports in our office about both robocalls, the calls to your home number and messages, and also text messages saying, because of long lines on Election Day, if you plan to vote for Obama, you can vote on Wednesday. And they were said, CNN, breaking news, Democrats to vote on Wednesday. Yeah. And this kind of stuff isn't just a prank or a game. It's against the law, and we've referred all of those things to the FBI and local officials, and I hope they get to the bottom of it.
Before we finish, we're out of time. One quick thing, your favorite election jurisdiction in the state of Missouri, do you want to put that out there?
I've got a lot of favorites, but I will tell you, the city of St. Louis did a great job this year, and I really applaud their efforts to get their act together.